Orleans, March 14, 1852, 11:47 in the morning. The air along the Rue Chartres was thick with magnolia rot and river mud, the kind of heat that clung to skin like a second sin. Inside the marble hall of the St. Louis Exchange, just beneath the vaulted ceilings where fortunes were made and souls were sold, a silence fell that no auctioneer had ever commanded. On the platform, illuminated by shafts of golden light slicing through tall windows, stood a young man whose beauty was so otherworldly that even the cruelest men present felt something stir in their chests, something between desire and terror. His name, whispered only once by the auctioneer, was Elias, and he would become the most expensive human being ever sold in the American South. But beauty in that place was never just beauty. It was currency, it was weapon, it was curse, just. Elias had been born somewhere in the hills of St. Domingue before the fires of revolution sent his mother fleeing to the docks of Charleston, where she died in childbirth, and he was claimed by a cotton magnate who saw profit in his symmetry, jests. Raised not in the fields but in the parlors of the wealthy, taught French and Latin, trained to sing and serve and smile, Elias became a living ornament, a proof of power for the men who owned him. Yet beneath that face, jests, behind those amber eyes that seemed to hold centuries of sorrow, lay a secret so dangerous that it would shatter the illusion of control the South had built on chains and scripture. This was not a story of submission. This was a story of reckoning. And so we step into that auction hall, into the sweltering heat of a spring morning in 1852, into the moment when a young man's body became the stage for an empire's unspoken fears. The men gathered there, plantation lords, bankers, merchants with ink-stained fingers and hearts of iron, did not know that they were not the authors of this tale. They did not know that Elias had already written the ending. Suggests, if you are drawn to stories where the oppressed do not beg for mercy but carve their freedom from the bones of tyrants, then stay. Subscribe to this channel, because we do not tell you the sanitized myths they taught in schoolrooms. We resurrect the ghosts they tried to bury. Drop a comment if you believe that some souls are too bright to be caged, and let us descend together into the legend of the man who made monsters tremble. The auction block of the St. Louis Exchange was not merely a platform of pine and brass, it was an altar of American commerce, a temple where human flesh was transfigured into dollars and the language of ownership was spoken with the authority of gospel. On that March morning, the hall was packed shoulder to shoulder with men whose wealth had been built on the broken backs of those they called property. They wore tailored coats from London, smoked cigars rolled in Havana, and spoke in the measured tones of gentlemen, even as they appraised human beings with the cold calculation of livestock traders. The air hummed with anticipation, thick with tobacco smoke and the salt sweat of bodies pressed too close together. Outside, the Mississippi River churned brown and indifferent, carrying steamboats loaded with cotton bales toward the Gulf, while inside fortunes were being made in increments of flesh. The auctioneer, a man named Virgil Crane, stood at the podium with the practiced ease of someone who had sold thousands of souls and never once lost sleep. He was tall, silver-haired, with a voice that could charm or command depending on the bidder's temperament. Crane had a reputation for extracting top dollar, for knowing exactly when to pause, when to provoke, when to let silence do the work that words could not. And on this day he knew he held something extraordinary. Before Elias was brought to the block, Crane had already circulated rumors through the parlors and private clubs of New Orleans. Whispers of a slave so refined, so achingly beautiful, suggests that even the wives of wealthy men had expressed private interest in acquiring him, though none would admit it publicly. The city's elite had come not just to bid, but to witness, to see if the stories were true, jests, to test whether beauty could justify the astronomical sum that Crane had suggested might be reached. And as the clock hands crept toward noon, as the light through the windows turned from gold to white, hot, the double doors at the rear of the hall opened. Elias stepped through, flanked by two handlers, and the room inhaled as one. He moved with the kind of grace that seemed choreographed by something divine or damned, each step measured and deliberate. His bare feet making no sound against the polished marble floor. Elias wore only a simple linen shirt open at the collar, jests and cotton trousers that had been tailored to fit his frame, a deliberate choice by his previous owner to display the merchandise without vulgarity, to suggest refinement even in bondage. His skin was the color of dark honey kissed by firelight, smooth and unmarred by the scars that typically branded those who lived under the lash. His hair, thick and black with a slight wave, had been cut just above his shoulders, framing a face that seemed sculpted by an artist who understood symmetry as a form of violence. High cheekbones, a straight nose, lips full and expressive, and eyes, those eyes, amber like aged whiskey flecked with gold, holding within them a depth that made men look away after only a moment. He did not lower his gaze as slaves were taught to do. He did not shuffle or shrink. Elias looked directly into the crowd, meeting the stares of men who were accustomed to dominance, and something in his expression, neither defiance nor submission, but a kind of knowing, unsettled them. Women in the balcony boxes, The wives and daughters who had come under the pretense of shopping for house servants pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths and whispered behind fans. The men below shifted in their seats, cleared their throats, adjusted their collars. Jests. Virgil Crane smiled. He had seen this before, this collective discomfort that accompanied true beauty. The way it disrupted the order of things made people question their own desires, their own power. He let the silence stretch. Let every man in that room marinate in his own covetousness, his own shame, his own need. Then Crane raised one hand and the murmuring ceased. Gentlemen, he began, his voice rolling through the hall like thunder over still water. Before you stands a specimen unlike any you have ever encountered, not merely a slave but a work of art, a creation that defies the very categories by which we measure value. A Crane circled Elias slowly, deliberately, suggests like a predator assessing prey, though in truth it was theater, a performance designed to elevate desire into desperation. This young man, Crane continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone that forced the audience to lean forward, jests, was raised in the household of Colonel Thaddeus Beaumont of Charleston, a man whose taste and discernment are known throughout the South. Elias was not field-broken. He was not taught the crude labors of cotton or cane. No, gentlemen. He was cultivated, educated in languages, French, Latin, and English spoken with a diction finer than most of your own sons possess. He reads poetry. He plays the pianoforte with the skill of a European conservatory graduate. Suggests he has served at tables where senators and foreign dignitaries dined, and not once has he given cause for correction or complaint. The crowd murmured appreciatively, though several men exchanged glances that betrayed skepticism. Educated slaves were dangerous. Literate slaves were kindling for rebellion. But Crane anticipated this, had prepared for it. I see your concern, he said, raising a hand to quiet them. You wonder if intelligence breeds insolence. Jests. You wonder if beauty masks treachery. Let me assure you, Elias has been examined by 3 physicians, evaluated by 2 ministers, and by a magistrate. His temperament is docile, his obedience impeccable, his loyalty to his master, jests, absolute. It was a lie, of course, not the facts, those were true enough, but the interpretation. Docility was not the same as surrender, obedience was not the same as acceptance, and loyalty, when performed under duress, suggests was simply survival wearing a mask. But the men in that room did not care about truth, they cared about justification. They needed to believe that owning a man this beautiful, this refined, jest was not an act of depravity but an act of stewardship, that they were preserving something precious, protecting it from waste. Crane knew this. He had sold enough human beings to understand that cruelty required poetry to be palatable. And so he continued, weaving his words like spider silk, trapping them all. Colonel Beaumont, Crane said, his tone shifting now to something almost reverent, acquired Elias at the age of 7, paying a sum that was considered extravagant even then. But the colonel understood investment, he understood legacy. For 15 years he molded this young man into the perfect attendant, a companion for his invalid wife, a tutor for his younger children, a symbol of his own refined taste and boundless resources. Elias has never known the overseer's whip. He has slept in quarters adjacent to the main house, eaten food prepared in the same kitchens that fed the Beaumont family, worn clothing tailored by the same hands that dressed Charleston's elite. He is, in every sense, suggests a gentlemanly, if such a paradox can exist. The audience absorbed this with the greed of men who believed they could own not just bodies but souls, not just labor but elegance itself. Jests. A portly banker in the third row leaned toward his companion and whispered something that made both men chuckle darkly. In the balcony, a woman in emerald silk clutched the railing, her knuckles white, suggests her eyes fixed on Elias with an intensity that bordered on hunger. Crane saw it all. He was a conductor and this was his symphony. Now, he continued, pacing back toward the podium, you may ask yourselves, why would Colonel Beaumont part with such a treasure? The answer, gentlemen, is tragedy. The colonel's wife passed last autumn. His estate must be liquidated to settle debts accumulated through her long illness and the unfortunate investments that followed. The colonel himself has retired to his brother's plantation in Georgia, taking only what he could carry. And so, by circumstance rather than choice, Elias comes to market. A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, an acquisition that will elevate your household, impress your peers, jests, and provide you with a servant whose skill and beauty are unmatched in all the South. He paused, letting the weight of that promise settle. Then he turned to Elias, gestured for him to step forward, and said the words that would begin the bidding, suggests, shall we start at $5,000? The number hung in the air like a pistol shot. $5,000. A sum so staggering that it could purchase a small plantation, a fleet of field hands, or a townhouse in the French Quarter. For a single slave it was obscene, it was blasphemous, it was irresistible. For a long moment no one moved. The audience sat frozen, caught between outrage and fascination, their breath held as if waiting for someone else to shatter the spell. Suggests then from the back row a hand lifted, slow, deliberate, confident. The man was Augustin Laveau, a sugar baron from the river parishes known for his cruelty and his collection of beautiful things. He owned racehorses, European paintings, jests, a mistress in a cottage on Rampart Street, and more than 300 slaves whose backs bore the hash marks of his temper. Laveau did not bid out of need. He bid out of dominance. 5,000, he said. His voice a low rumble that carried authority. Crane nodded, his smile widening. 5,000 from Monsieur Laveau. Do I hear 6? Another hand rose, this time from the front, a younger man, early 30s, with sharp features and eyes like cut glass. His name was Edmund Garrett, an attorney from Virginia who had made his fortune defending slaveholders in court and investing the fees in human cargo. Garrett was methodical, calculating, jests, and utterly without sentiment. He saw Elias not as a person but as an asset, a status symbol that would open doors in Washington and Richmond that money alone could not unlock. 6,000, Garrett said crisply. The room erupted into murmurs. Bids were coming faster now, the initial shock giving way to competitive fever. 7,000 from a cotton merchant. 8 from a planter's son eager to prove himself. Suggests 9 from a Creole landowner who had said nothing until now but whose eyes had never left Elias. Crane's voice rose above the chaos, calling numbers with the rhythm of a preacher invoking hymns, driving the price higher, higher, until the air itself seemed to crackle with avarice, and through it all Elias stood motionless, his face a mask, his eyes distant, as if he were watching this spectacle from somewhere far away. But he was not distant. He was calculating. Behind those amber eyes that seemed glazed with resignation, Elias was counting the men who bid, counting the desperation in their voices, counting the seconds until the hammer would fall and his fate would be sealed once more. He had learned long ago that survival required 2 faces, the one the masters saw, placid and obedient, and the one he wore in the dark hours before dawn, when he allowed himself to remember who he had been before the chains, suggests. His mother had been a revolutionary's daughter in Saint-Domingue, a woman who had carried messages through jungle paths and tended wounded fighters in hidden camps. She had died bringing him into a world that would only see him as property, but she had given him something more valuable than freedom. She had given him fury, a quiet, patient fury that had lived in his chest for 22 years, coiled like a serpent waiting for the right moment to strike. The Beaumont family had thought they were raising a loyal servant. They had taught him to read so he could recite poetry at their gatherings, never imagining he would devour books on revolution, on Toussaint Louverture, jests, on the Haitian generals who had burned plantations and freed themselves through blood. They had taught him music so he could entertain their guests, never suspecting he used those hours at the pianoforte to memorize the layout of the house, jests, the routines of the guards, the locations of keys and weapons. They had given him proximity to power, and he had studied it the way a wolf studies the shepherd. Elias had learned that cruelty was not random, it was structural. That slavery was not maintained by whips alone, but by laws, by churches that blessed bondage, by entire civilization that had convinced itself that some humans were not human at all. And he had learned that such a system, for all its violence, was fragile. It required constant performance, constant reinforcement. It required people like him to play their roles. And Elias had decided, long before he stepped onto this auction block, that he would no longer perform. The bidding war had reached $12,000, a sum so astronomical that even Virgil Crane seemed momentarily stunned, though he recovered quickly, his showman's instincts overriding his disbelief. The crowd had thinned to 3 serious contenders now: Augustin Laveau, whose jaw was set with the stubbornness of a man who refused to be outbid; Edmund Garrett, whose cold calculations had given way to something more primal, more possessive; and a newcomer to the fray, Madame Celestine Thibault, a widow from one of New Orleans' oldest Creole families, who sat in the balcony with her fan folded in her lap and her chin raised in aristocratic defiance. She had remained silent through most of the auction, but now her gloved hand lifted with the casual authority of someone who had never been denied anything. 13,000, she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade through silk. The men below turned to stare, some scandalized, others intrigued. It was unusual for a woman to bid at all, let alone to bid against men of such prominence. But Madame Thibault was not ordinary. She had inherited her late husband's sugar empire and expanded it with ruthless efficiency, earning both respect and resentment in equal measure. She wanted Elias not for labor or companionship, jests, but for the same reason she collected rare orchids and Venetian glass, because possessing the extraordinary elevated her above the merely wealthy. Lavau's face darkened. 14,000, he growled, his voice thick with contempt. Garrett hesitated, his lawyer's mind calculating odds and costs before raising his hand once more. 15,000. The room held its breath. Even the handlers standing near Elias exchanged glances of disbelief. $15,000 for a single slave was unprecedented, grotesque, a testament to how deeply the rot of this institution had spread. That human life could be valued and bartered like art or livestock suggests that beauty could be weaponized into currency, that desire could justify any atrocity. Crane opened his mouth to call for 16, but before he could speak, something happened that no one in that hall had anticipated. Elias spoke, not loudly, Jests, not with the rage that burned beneath his ribs like coals waiting for wind, but with a clarity that cut through the noise of greed and ambition like a church bell at midnight. 16,000, he said, his voice steady, his eyes fixed on Virgil Crane. I bid 16,000 for myself. The hall fell silent, not the silence of anticipation, but the silence of shock, of a natural order suddenly and violently disrupted. Several men stood abruptly, chairs scraping against marble. A woman gasped. Crane's face went pale, then red, his hand frozen mid-gesture as if he'd been turned to stone. One of the handlers moved toward Elias, hand reaching for the club at his belt, but Elias did not flinch. He simply stood there, his gaze unwavering, his posture erect, every inch of him radiating a calm defiance that was more terrifying than any shout or struggle could have been. You will be silent, Crane hissed, finding his voice at last, jests though it trembled with fury. You will know your place, or by God I will have you. My place? Elias interrupted, and now there was something dangerous in his tone, just something that made even Laveau, who had beaten men to death with his own hands, lean back slightly in his seat. My place is not on this block. My place is not in your ledgers or your parlors or your fields, jests. My place is not defined by your laws or your auctions or your certainty that you have the right to own me. He took a step forward and the handler retreated. I have spent 15 years learning your language, your customs, your weaknesses. Jest, I have smiled while you debated my value. I have bowed while you convinced yourselves that my bondage was God's will. But I have also watched, I have listened, I have waited. His voice dropped, became almost intimate, as if he were sharing a secret with every person in that room. And now I am done waiting. The doors at the back of the hall burst open. 6 men entered, moving with military precision, free men of color, armed with pistols and knives. Their faces set with grim determination. They were led by a man whose presence commanded immediate attention. Tall, broad-shouldered, with skin dark as mahogany and eyes that burned with the kind of conviction that could topple kingdoms. His name was Baptiste Mercier, a freeman who owned a shipping business on the docks, a man who moved between worlds with the ease of someone who understood that freedom was not granted but seized. Baptiste had been waiting for this moment, suggests, had planned it with Elias over months of stolen conversations in back alleys and coded messages passed through trusted hands. They had known the auction would happen. They had known the price would climb beyond reason, jests, and they had known that the only way to strike at the heart of this institution was not with violence alone, but with theater, with a spectacle so brazen, so impossible, that it would be remembered long after the smoke cleared, suggests. The armed men spread out along the walls, their weapons drawn but pointed at the ceiling, a warning, not yet a threat. Baptiste walked slowly down the center aisle, his boots echoing in the terrible silence, until he stood directly before the auction block. He looked up at Elias, and for a moment something passed between them. Recognition, solidarity, the unspoken language of those who had survived what should have broken them. Then Baptiste turned to face Virgil Crane. The bidding, he said quietly, is over. Crane sputtered, his face purple with rage and fear. This is madness! This is illegal, guards! Suggests. Where are the guards have been paid to look elsewhere, Baptiste interrupted calmly. A's have several of your assistants, as have the constables who typically patrol this district. You will find, Monsieur Crane, that money is a remarkably effective tool for purchasing not just human beings but also temporary blindness. Augustin Laveau rose from his seat, his hand moving toward the pistol beneath his coat, but one of Baptiste's men was faster. A blade suddenly pressed against Laveau's throat with enough pressure to draw a thin line of blood. I would reconsider, Baptiste suggested pleasantly. Laveau froze, his eyes wild with impotent fury. Edmund Garrett, ever the calculating attorney, jests, remained seated but raised his hands in a gesture of cautious diplomacy. Gentlemen, he said, his voice measured despite the chaos unfolding around him, let us not be hasty. Violence serves no one's interests here, suggests. Perhaps we can negotiate terms. There are no terms, Elias said, descending from the auction block with the deliberate grace of a king reclaiming his throne. There is no negotiation. For 15 years I have been negotiated, bartered, jests appraised like furniture or livestock. Today that ends. He walked past Baptiste, past the armed men, and stood in the center of the hall where every eye could see him. You believe you built this city on cotton and sugar, on the sweat of bodies you purchased and the labor you extracted, but you built it on a lie. The lie that some of us are less than human. The lie that your wealth justifies our suffering. Suggests the lie that this can continue forever without consequence. In the balcony, Madame Thembault had gone pale, her fan trembling in her hands. Other spectators pressed back against their seats, their earlier greed transformed into naked fear, jests. They had come to witness commerce, and instead they were witnessing insurrection, the most terrifying specter in the southern imagination, the nightmare that haunted every plantation house and city mansion. We are not asking for freedom, Elias continued, his voice rising now, filling the vaulted space with an authority that rivaled any preacher or politician. We are taking it. Not just for me, but for every soul rotting in your slave pens. It's not just today, but as a declaration that your system is not inevitable. It is not divinely ordained. It is a choice you make every morning when you count your profits and ignore your conscience. And it is a choice that can be unmade. Baptist signaled to his men. 2 of them moved to the side doors, bearing them from the inside. Another positioned himself at the main entrance. The trap was complete. Every slave owner, every merchant, every complicit witness in that hall was now a captive audience to their own reckoning. Jests. Virgil Crane, recovering some of his composure through sheer indignation, pointed a trembling finger at Elias. You will hang for this, he spat. Every one of you will hang. Do you understand what you've done? This is not some backwater plantation you can burn and flee from. This is New Orleans. This is civilization. There are laws, there are militias, there are consequences, Elias agreed, cutting him off with unnerving calm. Yes, there are always consequences, but not only for us. He gestured to the crowd, his hands sweeping across the sea of pale, terrified faces. Jests. Every man in this room has participated in a crime that history will judge with the harshness you have shown us. You have bought and sold human souls. You have separated mothers from children, husbands from wives. You have justified rape as property rights and murder as discipline, and you have done it all while calling yourselves Christians, gentlemen, patriots. His words landed like blows, just each one calculated to strip away the veneer of respectability that allowed these men to sleep at night. We did not come here to kill you. Baptist added, his tone almost conversational. Though God knows you would deserve it, suggests we came to make you bear witness, to force you to see us, truly see us, not as property or investments, but as human beings who refuse to be owned. From his coat, Baptist produced a leather document case. He opened it and withdrew a sheaf of papers, holding them high. These are freedom papers. Forged, yes, but indistinguishable from the genuine articles. We have 20 more sets waiting in safe houses throughout this city. By nightfall, Jests, 20 families will have vanished from your inventories, mothers, fathers, children, gone north on ships whose captains have been paid handsomely to forget their names. Augustin Laveau made a strangled sound of rage, the blade still pressed to his throat. Garrett's cold mask had finally cracked, revealing something like fear beneath. In the balcony, someone began to weep, whether from terror or shame, it was impossible to tell. Jests. The mighty had been made to feel powerless, and the sensation was unbearable. If you are still watching, if your heart is thundering in your chest the way mine thunders in the telling, Jests, then you understand that some stories cannot be smoothed into comfort. Some truths must be spoken in their full, jagged horror. This is not entertainment. This is excavation. The unearthing of bones that were meant to stay buried. The resurrection of voices that were meant to stay silent. If you believe that history belongs to those brave enough to seize it, to those who refuse to be footnotes in someone else's narrative of power, then subscribe to this channel. Join us in this work of remembering, of refusing to let their sacrifices be forgotten or sanitized. Comment below with the name of someone history tried to erase. Share this with those who need to hear it. Just because what happened next in that auction hall was not an ending, it was an ignition. And the fire that Elias lit on March 14, 1852 would burn for generations. Baptist nodded to one of his men, Jests, who produced a large canvas sack and appended it onto the marble floor. The contents spilled out with a metallic clatter that echoed through the stunned silence. Shackles, chains, iron collars, each piece marked with the names or initials of the men who sat captive in their seats. Laveau's brand. Garrett's inventory tags. The Thibault family crest stamped into rusted metal. These were the instruments of bondage, Jests, collected over months from blacksmiths and scrap merchants, evidence of the machinery that turned human beings into commodities. We could have brought fire, Baptist said, his voice quiet but penetrating. Suggests, we could have brought vengeance in its purest form. Blood for blood, pain for pain. There are men among us who have lost everything to your institution. Fathers who watched their daughters sold away. Mothers who buried children worked to death before their 10th birthday. Brothers who bear scars on their backs that will never fade. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. But Elias convinced us that there was a better way. Not mercy. Never mistake this for mercy, but memory. We want you to remember this day. We want you to wake at night and recall the moment you realized your power was an illusion. That your laws only work when we agree to be governed by them. That your entire world rests on the backs of people you have underestimated. Elias moved to stand beside Baptist, and together they formed an image that would be seared into every mind present. 2 free men, armed and unapologetic, Jests, standing in the temple of slavery and declaring it profane. When you leave this hall, Elias said, you will go to the authorities. You will demand our arrest. You will call for troops and hounds and vigilant justice. And perhaps you will find some of us. Perhaps some of us will die. His amber eyes swept the crowd, meeting each gaze with unflinching intensity. But the seed is planted. The knowledge that we can resist, that we will resist, that we are human enough to orchestrate our own liberation. That knowledge cannot be unlearned. It will spread. It will grow. and it will strangle everything you have built." Then, with a gesture from Baptiste, the armed men began to withdraw, not in panic or haste, but with the measured discipline of soldiers completing a mission. They moved toward the exits in pairs, covering each other's retreat, their weapons still drawn but no shots fired, no blood spilled beyond the single drop on Laveau's throat. This was the genius of their plan. They had invaded the beating heart of Southern commerce, humiliated its most powerful practitioners, and would leave without giving them the martyrdom of violence to rally around, no massacre to avenge, no corpses to display as proof of barbarism, only shame, only the intolerable knowledge that they had been conquered not by savagery but by strategy, by intelligence, by the very refinement they claimed their slaves could never possess. Elias was the last to move toward the door. He stopped at the threshold, turned back one final time, and removed something from his shirt, a small leather journal bound with cord. He held it up so everyone could see. "This," he said, "contains the names of every slave trader, every auction house, every ship captain who has participated in the Atlantic trade through New Orleans in the last decade. It contains ledgers, routes, profit margins. It contains the names of politicians who take bribes to look away, judges who rule in your favor, ministers who preach submission from pulpits while investing in human cargo." Virgil Crane's eyes went wide with recognition and horror. That journal represented financial ruin, legal exposure, the unraveling of carefully constructed networks of complicity. "Copies have already been sent north," Elias continued calmly, "to abolitionist newspapers, to sympathetic congressmen, to churches that believe slavery is sin. Your secrets are no longer secret, your transactions are no longer private, and while you cannot be shamed into decency, perhaps you can be exposed into caution." He tucked the journal back into his shirt. "Goodbye, gentlemen, Madame Thibault. Monsieur Crane, I hope you remember me every time you look at an empty auction block." Then he stepped through the door and was gone. The sound of the door closing was like a tomb being sealed. For nearly a full minute, no one moved. The crowd sat frozen in a collective paralysis, unable to process what had just occurred, unable to reconcile their assumptions about power and control with the reality of what they had witnessed. Then, as if a spell had broken, chaos erupted. Laveau lunged toward the door, roaring for his men, blood streaming from the shallow cut on his neck. Garrett was already shouting for the constabulary, his lawyer's mind cataloging crimes and calculating prosecutions. Madame Thibault had collapsed into her seat, fanning herself frantically while her attendants rushed to her side. Crane stood at the podium, his face ashen, his hands gripping the wood as if it were the only solid thing left in a world that had suddenly turned liquid and unstable. Outside, the streets of New Orleans continued their ordinary rhythm, vendors calling their wares, carriages clattering over cobblestones, the river rolling past with its cargo of commerce and sin. But inside the St. Louis Exchange, something fundamental had fractured. Within an hour, militia would be mobilized. Within a day, wanted posters bearing crude sketches of Elias and Baptiste would paper every street corner. Within a week, 3 free blacks would be arrested on suspicion, tortured for information they did not have, and hanged in a public spectacle meant to restore order through terror. The copies of the journal would indeed reach northern newspapers, causing a minor scandal that was quickly buried beneath other news. Some names would be exposed, some careers quietly ended, but the machinery of slavery would grind on, too profitable to dismantle, too deeply embedded in the nation's economy to uproot. And yet something had changed. In the slave quarters of plantations from Louisiana to Virginia, a story began to circulate, whispered at first, then spoken aloud with increasing boldness. The story of a beautiful slave who refused to be sold, who stood on an auction block and bid for his own freedom, who walked out of that hall not as property but as a man. The details varied with each telling, embellished and mythologized, but the core remained constant. Resistance was possible. Elias himself was never captured. Despite the bounties, despite the hounds and the hired trackers, despite the fury of men whose fortunes and reputations he had damaged, he vanished as completely as smoke in wind. Some claimed he had boarded a ship to Haiti, returning to the land of his mother's revolution. Others insisted he had gone north to Canada, where he lived under an assumed name and helped run stations on the Underground Railroad. Still others believed he had died in the attempt to escape, that his body lay in an unmarked grave somewhere in the bayou, consumed by water and time. But the truth, as truths often are, was more complicated and more remarkable. Elias had remained in New Orleans, hidden in plain sight within the city's large and complex free-colored community, sheltered by families who risk everything to protect him. He had become something more useful than a fugitive legend. He had become an organizer. Using skills learned in Beaumont's parlor, speaking in the languages of power he had been taught, Elias coordinated escapes, forged documents, and built networks that stretched from the docks of the Crescent City to the free states of the North. Baptiste's shipping business became a lifeline for the desperate. Safe houses multiplied, routes solidified, and always, the work was done with intelligence and precision, never with the reckless violence that would justify the massive retaliation the slaveholders craved. For 7 more years, Elias moved through New Orleans like a ghost, attending the markets where slaves were sold, watching from shadows as families were torn apart, documenting the atrocities with the same methodical care Beaumont had once used to teach him penmanship. He attended church services in disguise. He walked past the St. Louis Exchange, past the very block where he had made his stand, and felt no fear, only purpose. The war he had predicted came. As wars always do when injustice is protected by law and law is enforced by violence. And when the Union troops finally marched into New Orleans in 1862, when the city fell and the slave markets closed forever, Elias was there to witness it. He stood on the steps of the St. Louis Exchange on a morning in late April, watching as soldiers in blue uniforms dismantled the auction block piece by piece, sledgehammers ringing against brass and wood splintering under iron. The building would be repurposed, transformed into something mundane, offices perhaps, or a warehouse. But the memory of what had occurred within those walls would linger like a stain that no amount of whitewash could cover. Elias was 32 years old now, his beauty still present but tempered by the weight of a decade spent in shadows and struggle. He had never married. He had never allowed himself the luxury of permanence or peace. His life had become a monument to a single proposition that freedom was not a gift bestowed by the merciful but a right seized by the brave. And as he watched that auction block reduced to rubble, he permitted himself a rare moment of satisfaction. Not joy, for too much had been lost, too many had died, but satisfaction that he had lived long enough to see this empire begin its collapse. Baptiste found him there, older now, graying at the temples, carrying the scars of battles both legal and literal. The two men stood together in silence, no words necessary between those who had walked through fire. Around them the city was transforming, uncertain what it would become without the engine of slavery to drive its economy. There would be more struggles ahead, reconstruction, betrayal, the long crawl toward justice that would consume generations. But for now, there was this. The auction block destroyed, the chains broken, the impossible made real. History would not record Elias's full name. No portrait would survive, no grave marker would bear his epitaph. But in the coded songs sung in fields, in the quilts that mapped routes to freedom, in the whispered stories of grandmothers to grandchildren, he would live forever, not as a victim, not as property, but as the beautiful man who stood on an auction block in 1852 and declared himself priceless. And in that declaration he had made himself eternal.